Medieval love, while romanticized, is not always as romantic as we think. I've seen fictional modern media takes on the medieval period, and some are clearly inspired and not entirely accurate always. Some of these media examples are The Sims Medieval, Dark Souls, A Song of Ice and Fire, and of course, Game of Thrones. It also is a popular theme for in-person immersion as well, such as at medieval times. But what really is the medieval period? We have to first look at that before understanding love in the period. The medieval period was also called the Middle Ages. It began around 476 AD after a great loss of power started to take over Europe. It ended between 1400 and 1450, but was also broken up into three ages: the early Middle Ages, the High, and the Late. While there was war such as the 100 Years' War or invasions happening, advancements were happening as well intellectually with the opening of universities. It's framed with images like knights and castles, which has inspired much literature. Understanding medieval romance literature is important to understanding love in the Middle Ages. I quickly grew to understand this fact, as documentation was not often found or kept that showcased love other than the works in the romance genre at that time. This literature would be written typically in prose, poetry, or verse. One of the most known stories is that of the knight Arthur. Another is Knight Lancelot. These literary love interests were regarded well for their heroic deeds. For this project, I decided to look at love from the two different classes, upper and peasant. We'll start with the upper class part of it. Marriage was considered the major part of a partnership, as you could not be completely physically together until you were married. Marriage for love in the upper class was oftentimes not an option. Many were put into arranged marriages for political reasons such as mending ties or gaining access to land. Before the 12th century, it didn't require the consent of both parties as well. This made it easy to arrange marriages for noble children, with young girls marrying as early as 12. A dowry was important and from the bride's family. It was land or money or another important gift. The husband's family typically also gave the bride some sort of an inheritance. Divorce was very unfavored and had to have a serious political or religious reason to proceed with. The sad part of most of these marriages were that the bride and groom had little to no say, and the marriages would often be arranged at an earlier age for the children of nobles. If you were the child of a king, it would be up to the king to decide who you would marry. Remember that marriage was seen as a political bargaining chip in the Middle Ages, therefore there was much to gain for the king if he chose to marry off his children to other nations. For this project, I wanted to find in-person artifacts as well, but my sources were very limited, as you can imagine. Being that the United States were founded after the Middle Ages, actual artifacts typically are held in Europe. That was why I was excited when my research led me to a museum close enough to me that I could get there. I took a trip to Alma, Wisconsin for a day to see the Castle Rock Museum. Just seeing the entrance online was enough to convince me, but going in person was a completely different view, as Alma was gorgeous. They held many artifacts inside, such as sets of armor from various time periods, but I was here for specific things. They had a setup to show what was worn by knights during the Middle Ages, which would have been what fueled many of the romantic stories coming out of authors at this time. I found this all interesting, but a few pieces of their collection were the most exciting for me. One of the reasons I am so interested in medieval romance topics is due to learning about King Henry VIII and the complicated situation between him and his 6 wives. The Castle Rock Museum had some artifacts on this, such as his shield. Before I get into the next artifact, I'll explain the situations leading up to it. Much like I mentioned before, it was decided for Henry that he would be married at the young age of 11. His brother Arthur died in 1502 after months of being married to Catherine of Aragon. It was decided soon after then Henry would marry her in response. When they did marry, Henry was 17 and Catherine was 23. The reason Henry VIII intrigues me, as it has often been said, is that he only wanted to marry for love. After the two were married, historians would note that the marriage was unusually good between the two. They were married for around 20 years, but after only having a daughter, Mary, Henry thought that he was being punished for marrying his brother's wife. He soon found another love interest in Anne Boleyn. This was complicated as divorce was frowned upon in the Middle Ages. He fought for her, though, even after the Pope told him he could not deny his marriage with Catherine and that she was his lawful wife. So he decided to go against the church. He founded a new one and under it annulled his marriage with Catherine. This caused her to be banished, and their daughter, Mary, was deemed illegitimate. Henry wrote love letters to Anne at this time, and these letters show a sequence of love that was not recorded in such a way at all during the time. It was daring. Anne and him ended up having one daughter, Elizabeth, and as she struggled to have a male heir, Henry found himself growing interest in the next. Anne's lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. Due to his love interest changing again and his frustrations at having no son, Anne Boleyn was charged with adultery and was beheaded. A very similar instrument used for this very thing was seen by myself at Castle Rock Museum, which really helps visualize the consequences within love in the Middle Ages as well. Henry's next wife, Jane Seymour, was able to bless him with a son. Edward VI was born to Jane and King Henry on October 24, 1537, but disaster struck. Jane had a tough birth that lasted 2 days and later would die 12 days after giving birth to Edward. This took a toll on Henry, and he would later choose to be buried next to her at Windsor Castle. But that was not his last wife. For political reasons, Henry was married to Anne of Cleves for around 6 months. This ended with annulment, as Henry had been disappointed in her appearance after seeing a portrait beforehand, and she agreed mutually on the grounds of non-consummation. She would get to keep her life, however, Henry would marry again, and very soon after, in fact, 16 days after the annulment to Anne of Cleves. Catherine Howard was about 17 years old when she married a 49-year-old King Henry in 1540. Henry had a soft spot for her as well, regarding her very similar to a rose without a thorn. It was only a year later that Catherine found herself under scrutiny. As a flirty, youthful woman, she had previous affairs before Henry. It was also alleged that she was having an affair with someone close to the king, and there was evidence within love letters. She would be charged with adultery and beheaded in 1542. Henry's last wife, Catherine Parr, would outlive the king. Married in 1543, she was 31 to Henry's 52. She had previously been widowed and was wise for it. She was motherly to her stepchildren and also a comfort for Henry in his old age. After his death in 1547, Catherine married a longtime love of hers, Thomas Seymour, ironically Jane's brother. Henry's story shows how complicated love was for the upper class and how drama affected the outcome for the woman. It warns about the dangers of not following the church's regulations on marriage and love. But I find it inspiring in the sense Henry truly felt love, even if fleeting, for some of his wives. His love letters stand as a test of time to show that emotions have always affected decisions. Next, we'll take a look at the peasant class, which made up 80% of the population, and what love was like for them. Marriage in the peasant class was quite easy. Couples would need to notify their local lord, but you didn't have to go to a church for it to be legal. You could get married at a bar, a random lake, or even in your bed. Having a witness was recommended but not required. Sometimes for these weddings, something called a beer party would occur in the town that raised funds for the church and or the couple. These could go for days. They would have a specific drink called bride ale, which is where we get the word bridal from today. Most peasant class women worked. There were dairymaids who were responsible for making butter and cheese and gathering milk. It was considered a good idea to have a daughter that was one. Being an alewife was not as accessible to women, but they were women that brewed ales. There were sex workers, often referred to as Winchester goose. It was considered a necessary profession, but laws still were formed that didn't allow it in some fashion. Women that were sex workers had to wear specific clothing, and to get out of the profession, you had to make an agreement to marry and start a family. There were also various tradeswomen, one example in particular being stonemasons. In my research, I was able to identify a very specific stonemason. Agnes Ramsay was the daughter of stonemason William Ramsay, who got her into the craft. She worked on many of the churches in London especially. I found her story interesting in the sense of what inferences I could make on the very little I knew about her. Her father died in 1349 from the Black Death, so she ended up taking over his business. She ended up marrying a fellow Mason, Robert Hubbard. There is an accusation, though, that Agnes's family kidnapped Robert and married him to Agnes. However, after being acquitted, Robert stayed. I assumed the two may have had a common passion in stonemason work, and that helped foster a developed relationship between the two. I also infer that Agnes was proud about her father's work, as she never took Robert's last name. Another interesting fact about Agnes was that she was part of the project that built Queen Isabella of France's tomb. She supposedly also is thought to be responsible for placing Edward II's heart within her tomb as well. If that doesn't say love, I do not know what does. This girl believed in it. While researching the peasant class, I found myself running into a lot of blocks from information. There wasn't much left behind by peasants other than financial records mainly. What I did find that could give me some insight into the lives of this class, of people in relation to their romantic inspirations, were archives of marriages and court disputes around those ages. One of my main resources for this was the Borthwick Institute archives, as they had looked further into the study of how marriage could be complicated in the Middle Ages with the files made against several couples. One in particular that was taken to court was against Robert Williamson and a servant named Amoda. This case happened between 1389 and 1390 in the winter. Amoda claimed that the two were married, but Robert denied this fact. Robert's brother Thomas also complicated things further by testifying to the court that he knew Amoda carnally, as he had put it. This was an accusation of infidelity. Amoda had to continue fighting for the one she wanted to be married to. In the court system, she needed to be able to prove without a doubt that she was married properly to Robert, but this would be difficult as their marriage happened without telling anyone. Her attorney presented her argument that Robert had publicly and with his own will said that he had married Amoda. It was said that they had expressed words of mutual consent and had consummated the marriage. They denied any activity happening with his brother Thomas. Amoda claimed that she had a good reputation and was known for being honest. She claimed that he was saying what he was to end the marriage between her and his own brother. There has been speculation that the brothers had decided upon the story preemptively. The evidence, however, was not substantial enough to prove anything on their end. Robert eventually succumbed and confessed to agreeing to marry Amoda and consummating their marriage thereafter. Here is what the court document said about the presiding decision. Because we have heard both by the confession of the said parties made in the judgment before us, and by other sufficient and lawful evidences in this business, the above said Amoda, plaintiff, has sufficiently proved her action brought before us in this case. Therefore, in this writing we have adjudged as our own sentence, and definitively the same Robert defendant to be the lawful husband of the same Amoda, and the same Amoda to be the lawful wife of the same Robert. In short, she had won. The stories I've told you in this video showcase the diverse landscape that love held within the Middle Ages. It shows that some strived for it, and some loved because they had to. While it was easy for the peasant class to get married, it was not easily proven in court. Things were even more difficult for the upper class as they had less choice in the matter of love. It was what was best for other people. What would they gain? I'm happy I did a deeper dive into what it was really like, and I hope that anyone watching has also learned something new. Thank you for listening. Keep in mind also, these stories affect the love that we have today.